Let us begin with one of the great imaginative works of Western culture, Plato's Symposium, because what I want to present to you today is just a few thoughts about the origins of this concept in the philosophical tradition, and then, of course, its link to Western theology. And in fact, I want to claim, this is maybe to expound a little on my title, that in Plato's Symposium in particular, we have a drama, and indeed the important point, and that will be significant for the moment when we turn to the theological reception, is I'd say it's a theodrama. The story of the Symposium is recited by Apollodorus, who was himself not at the banquet, but heard the story from Aristodemus, who was indeed present. Sympino, of course, means to drink with. The symposium is literally the drinking and the sharing of discourse. And the dialogue is composed of speeches given by different characters. The host, Agathon, summons the participants to speak in praise of the Greek god Eros. Socrates arrives late because he's lost in thought. Was he contemplating? Well, the speeches begin with Phaedrus, who asserts that Eros is the oldest god and is a great inspiration, as we can see in Achilles and Patroclus, in Alcestis and Admetus. And the subsequent speeches modify or criticize this position, culminating in the host's speech, Agathon, notabene his name, the good, wherein the tragic poet claims that the others have all failed to do justice to this god, who is in fact the youngest of the gods and is contemptuous of old age. Now Socrates, unlike the other speakers, does not begin with a eulogy of the god, but offers an analysis of the concept. Remember that for Socrates, rhetoric without dialectic is worthless. And he goes on to recount a meeting with a mysterious priestess called Diotima, who informs him that Eros is not a god, but a daimon, a spirit mediating between men and their desires. And she tells him that the supreme object of Eros is the form of absolute beauty, which can be attained after an ascent of the mind from physical to spiritual beauty and culminates in the experience of absolute beauty. Now, Diotima is, I think, an imaginative or fictitious personage. Think, for example, of her name. So she is the Gyne Mantinike. She is the woman from Mantinea, which implies the mantic arts. So she's the prophetess. This is the art that deals with the converse between humanity and the gods. And she is called Diotima, she that has honor from Zeus. So she represents a particular wisdom and authority. So here we have this imaginative figure and bringing in this religious dimension to Socrates' account of Eros. Now the figure of Socrates is tragic and comic. And in fact, at the end of the dialogue, the Symposium, he claims that the tragedian can also be a comedian. Remember, of course, that he is going to be executed and is accused of impiety, introducing new gods, and of course corrupting the youth. The date of the dinner party, the Symposium, is just before the trial of Socrates, so in 399 BC. So the trial of Socrates in 399 BC, so the banquet is probably around 416 BC. Now there's the remarkable figure in the dialogue of Alcibiades. And we are presented with Alcibiades drunken and brawling aloud, interrupting the Symposium, the drinking party, just after Socrates has given us what you imagine as the culmination of the Symposium with Diotima's account of true inspiration. He's brought into company by a flute girl and some other of his people supporting him. He stands at the door, crowned with a bushy wreath of ivy and violets, wearing a great array of ribbons on his head. "Good evening, sir," he says. "Will you admit to your drinking a fellow very far gone in liquor? Or shall we simply set a wreath on Agathon, which is indeed what we came for. So anyway, I tell you, sir, I was hindered from getting to you yesterday, but now I'm here with these ribbons on my hand, so I can pull them off mine and twine them around the head of the cleverest, the handsomest, if I may speak. Ah, you would laugh at me because I'm drunk." Right. So here we have this extraordinary representation of Dionysus in the figure of Alcibiades just after Socrates' speech. So here we have Alcibiades, the elegant and charismatic Kalos Kagathos, the ward of Pericles, the disciple of Socrates, with a profound fondness for his teacher. Alcibiades tells us how Socrates saved his life at the big start of the Peloponnesian War in 432 BC. So here we've got this eloquent, well-born and imposing man. Remember, he was appointed general, and in 415 BC, when a delegation from Segesta in Sicily appeared in Athens to summon support against other Sicilian cities, Alcibiades saw this as an opportunity for Athens to expand its power and wealth. So here we've got this figure representing power and ambition, and of course corruption. During the Feast of Adonis, some sacred herms were disfigured before Alcibiades leaves to Sicily, and he was accused of their wanton destruction in the drunken revels. But it was only after Alcibiades set sail to Sicily that the ship was posted to arrest him on account of profaning the mysteries. So here we have the juxtaposition of the dashing and swaggering Alcibiades, held responsible not only for the ill-fated Sicilian expedition, defeat, and of course betrayal of his own city, and the parody of the Eleusinian mysteries and the desecration of the sacred herms. So I think the irony of Plato's drama is very striking. So Socrates, who's accused of impiety, Socrates, who's accused of corruption, is contrasted with the truly corrupt figure of Alcibiades. And in fact, the image of Socrates' spiritual vacation, I think, is made very clear, where he says in the Apology, at many times and places, something divine and spiritual comes to me. The very thing which Meletus ridiculed in his indictment, I've had this from my childhood. It's a sort of voice that comes to me. And when it comes, it always holds me back from what I was thinking of doing, but never urges me forward. Now, Cicero translates this as the divinum aliquid, the somewhat divine. And so this, I think, parallels the speech of Diotima, the priestess who is providing the link to prophecy, and Alcibiades himself notes that he sees the divine within Socrates. He has this extraordinary image of the agalmata, of the statues or the images of the divine within Socrates. So, Socrates is claiming that there's a divine sign that is the principle that is shaping his life. And he, of course, in the Apology is teasing and provoking his accusers on being found guilty of betraying Athens. He proposes that as a punishment, the charges against him the punishment should be free meals at the Prytaneum, an honour usually awarded to athletes or notables. And the daunting and dispiriting effects of the long Peloponnesian War and the corrosive effects of materialism, relativism, and atheism of the avant-garde sophists in the Athenian Enlightenment had clearly disrupted and weakened the city. What we find through Plato's Republic is an appeal to a transcendent principle that is requisite for ethics and the properly ordered political state. The anupotheton achen, this supreme principle, which is linked to the essential or divine beauty, to theon kalon, of the Symposium 211e. So this idea that we find in the Republic of an objective good, that is the transcendent principle requisite for the good life and for the proper ordering of the state, is described famously through the image of the sun. And the term that's repeatedly used is the idea of the analogy, or the analogon. So we find this idea expressed by the Cambridge Platonist when he says, "Lift myself up in the theology of heavenly Plato. There I'll contemplate the archetype of this sun, that bright idea of steady good, that doth his beams dilate through all the world, all lives and beings propagate, a fair delineament of that good which in Plato's school is height, his tagathon with beauteous rays bedight." So that's from Henry Moore's Complete Poems. And some of you will be more familiar with Goethe's famous lines from Plotinus, in fact, from Ennead 1:6. "Wäre nicht das Auge sonnenhaft, die Sonne könnte es nie erblicken." So if the eye were not sun-like, it couldn't see the sun. This is this principle of the analogy, only like can be known by like, which we find in the Republic. So let's move from that theodrama of Plato and this principle of a transcendent goodness that may be subject to ridicule in the quotidian life with the Christian theological backdrop. Now, the biblical tradition seems prima vista ambivalent. We have striking instances of the vision of God in the prophet Isaiah, for example. And Jacob claims, "For I saw God face to face, and my soul was saved." We read of Moses. "Thus the Lord spoke to Moses face to face, as a man speaks to his friend." And even the tormented Job says, "I have heard you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you." Christ himself claims that the pure in heart will see God. And furthermore, we read in John the following, "Beloved, we are God's children now. It does not yet appear what we shall be, but we know that when he appears, we shall be like him, for we shall see him as he is." Now, notice this connection between likeness and seeing, which we found in Plato. However, there's another aspect to this. In Deuteronomy 4, God says to Moses, "You cannot see my face, for no man can see my face and live." And the psalmist maintains that God made darkness his hiding place. John maintains no one has ever seen God. And Paul notes that God is he whom no one has ever seen or can see. So what do we make of this ambivalent legacy? Well, I want to put to you that in recent New Testament scholarship there have been some developments of great significance for our topic of theosis. It has long been known that the letters of St. Paul are very early, and some of the materials, such as the Philippians hymn, predate the writing of the epistles. Yet the writings of Paul seem rather at odds with the synoptic Gospels, which were generally taken to be much earlier than the Gospel of John. But John was seen as the product of this Hellenizing process. Elements such as "He that has seen me has seen the Father," or the spiritualism of a vision of God as love, light, and spirit, was seen as aspects of this Hellenizing tendency. After all, deification was a common idea in the Roman Empire. The emperors were considered divine. And deification was a doctrine in the Orphic mysteries. Adolf von Harnack is a very illuminating critic of precisely this whole tradition. Moreover, theos in Greek is much more porous than deus in Latin. It has a broader meaning, it's more fluid. But recent scholarship has been proposing that the Gospel of John may well be much earlier than previously thought. And some scholars, notably George van Kooten, the Lady Margaret Professor at my own university, dates St. John's Gospel as early as 60 AD, i.e. prior to the destruction of the temple in AD 70. In fact, George thinks that the Gospel of Luke, in fact, is much later than the traditional attribution. So this completely reverses if correct, the attitudes towards the dating of the Gospels that were regarded as pretty widespreadly accepted about 2 or 3 decades ago. So, if this is correct, it would mean that John and Paul can be seen to be the very core of the Gospel. And maybe Origen was right to say that no one can understand John's Gospel without similarly laying on the breast of our Lord. If one places John and Paul at the heart of the Christian Gospel, then this has immense implications for the doctrine of theosis. Think about St. Paul in the second epistle to the Corinthians, where he says more than 14 years ago he was caught up in the third heaven and had a vision. The victory over death has been achieved by Christ for Paul, but it must be accomplished within as a principle of reality and not merely as a unique historical event. St. Paul offers a version of the Logos Christology of St. John, in which Christ is not just the pale Galilean rabbi, but a pre-existent cosmic principle. So, I'm suggesting that if we see John and Paul as really the heart of the Christian gospel, then this helps us, I think, to appreciate the significance of that idea of deification, which we find in figures such as Irenaeus, Hippolytus, Origen, Athanasius, and the Cappadocians. This is a tradition where the psalmist "Ye are gods" is often quoted, and of course the locus classicus is Athanasius, he became man that we might be deified. And clearly Athanasius was not a pantheist. And indeed, this is where we have the overlap with the Greek philosophical tradition, the idea that only like can be known by like. But moreover, the idea in Plotinus, in Ennead, or Treatise 4, 3, 8, 5:15 to 16, where he says, different souls look at different things and are and become what they look at. That is to say, that we are what we aspire to. Now, another factor in the history of theosis is Aristotle. We don't want to leave Aristotle out. And that is the doctrine of the nous poetikos, or as in the Latin tradition it was known, the intellectus agens, coming from the De Anima 3:5. Here Aristotle distinguishes between two kinds of reason. The higher reason is separate, impassible, and eternal, and the passive reason is the reason that dies with the body. Now Aquinas makes this is a rather mysterious passage and rather dense in Aristotle, but Aquinas comments on it and makes the active and passive reason parts of the soul. But in Meister Eckhart, this idea of the active intellect is absolutely key. And it's linked to the idea that we find in Plotinus of what Plotinus calls the kentron psyches, of this center of the soul that is intimately linked to the divine, or what then Meister Eckhart calls the spark. God's ground is my ground, and my ground, God's ground. Hence for Eckhart, sonship is essential rather than adoptive. He's talking of the filius naturalis Dei rather than the filius adoptivus. Of course, Eckhart was condemned for those passages which were suggesting that the highest part of the soul is uncreated. And this constitutes one of the key questions in the area. Well, Paul says, not I, but Christ in me. But how do we understand this? With deification, are we talking about essentialization or substitution? But certainly what is the case is that we're dealing with what's often referred to as the indwelling Christ within, and not just, as it were, forensic Saviour without. And indeed, many would argue that it's actually the idea of the incarnation that provides a buffer against some of the excesses of the doctrine of deification, which can obscure the distinction between the creator and the created. But certainly this idea of transformation into the image of the divine as revealed in Christ is key to the idea of theosis in the Western tradition. Now, one school which inherited this Eckhardian emphasis upon deification was that of the Cambridge Platonists. So consider the following passage from John Smith from his Select Discourses. He says, "The true metaphysical and contemplative man is running and shooting above his own logical or self-rational life, pierceth into the highest life, such a one who by universal love and holy affection, abstracting himself from himself, endeavours the nearest union with the divine essence that may be, kentron, kentro, synapsas, as Plotinus speaks, knitting his own centre, if he have any, unto the centre of divine being. So here you can see quite explicitly in the Cambridge Platonist John Smith the utilization of this, what one might call, broadly speaking, Descartian tradition. In fact, we have a rather intriguing reflection of this in a later philosopher, Lord Shaftesbury, who, in a way, this links back to Plato of the Apology. He says, we have in each of us a daimon, genius, angel, or guardian spirit to which we are strictly joined and committed from our earliest dawn of reason or our moment of birth. The Romans called this genius and the Greeks the daimon. In the Christian West, of course, this is what becomes the guardian angel. And Shaftesbury links this to the know thyself, which he construes as recognize thyself, which is as much to say divine yourself or be too. So here we have, within a philosophical tradition, the Cambridge Platonists and indeed Lord Shaftesbury, a reception of this tradition which we find going back to Plato and the Neoplatonists and the, in some respects, the transformation of the agent intellect of Aristotle. Now, I want to just conclude with some thoughts about the modern legacy of this tradition philosophically. In his book, God's Funeral, the English writer A.N. Wilson describes the 19th century as the general experience of the death of God, a process that he links, of course, explicitly to Hegel and Nietzsche, both of whom use that Lutheran topos quite explicitly. Yet, I want to conclude by offering some thoughts about the continuing presence of this idea of theosis in modern thought, especially German idealism. Now, German idealism is a deeply contested realm. One might contrast the approaches between such scholars as Pippin and Friedrich Beiser, whereby Pippin has an anti-metaphysical view of Hegel, in which Geist or spirit are not some quasi-theological principle, but a system of norms that constitute the horizon of human knowing and doing. For Beiser, by contrast, German idealism is basically a Platonic kind of rationalism, one with elements of Spinoza and Herder, in which nature is viewed as teleological and vitalistic. Now, I incline to the second interpretation, and I'll give you a few reasons why. So, in the work of Schelling, and particularly in his system of transcendental idealism of 1800, we find the idea that the imagination is, I quote, suspended between infinity and finitude, and forms into one. So the German he uses is eingebildet, and that word bild is the German for image, or Eikon. So the forming together is also the shaping together and is bringing into one. This is a radicalization of the Kantian idea of the constructive or productive imagination, as opposed to Aristotle's model of imagination as just rearranging the materials of memory. And Schelling, in his lectures on the philosophy of art, interprets the genius of an artist, so a figure like Raphael, who was his favorite, as the divine that indwells in the human. And on this view, that you quote, the poetic imagination of the infinite in the finite becomes identified with inspiration. he says this: Die Geschichte als Ganzes ist eine fortgehende, allmählich sich enthüllende Offenbarung des Absoluten. Also man kann in der Geschichte nie die einzelne Stelle bezeichnen, wo die Spur der Vorsehung oder Gott selbst gleichsam sichtbar ist. Denn Gott ist nie, wenn das Sein das ist, was in der objektiven Welt sich darstellt. Wäre er, so wären wir nicht, aber er offenbart sich fortwährend. Der Mensch führt durch seine Geschichte einen fortgehenden Beweis von dem Dasein Gottes. The human being, through his history, provides a continual proof of the existence of God. But this proof, he says, will only be clear at the end of history. I'll turn to Hegel, where he talks about a play of love with itself, ein Spielen der Liebe mit sich selbst. He says, das Leben Gottes und das göttliche Erkennen mag also wohl als ein Spielen der Liebe mit sich selbst ausgesprochen werden. The life of God and divine knowledge may be seen as a play of love with itself. As a disporting of love with itself. But this idea, he says, sinks into mere edification and even insipidity if it lacks the seriousness, the suffering, the patience, and the labor of the negative. So what we have here is the idea of God as the ens manifestativum sui. So God is the self-manifesting principle in the cosmos and, of course, in history. And, of course, the big debate between the German idealists was how we should understand this unfolding of the divine, this manifestation of the divine, which for Hegel is a necessary development from the divine essence, and for Schelling it's grounded in the unfathomable will of the Lord of being. But even Hegel can say that the reason of humanity, die Vernunft des Menschen, the consciousness of his essence, reason itself, ist eben das Göttliche im Menschen, is the divine in the human being. So I would want to say that what we have in the German idealists is, albeit a modified form, of this idea of what they would call the Gotteskindschaft, either the filiation of the deity, of this essential link between the human mind and the divine. And in that sense, a tradition that goes back to Plato. Well, the contrast between what is and what ought to be is a central aspect of belief in an unseen, transcendent world. In lecture 20 of his wonderful Varieties of Religious Experience, William James claimed that the visible world belongs to a larger spiritual domain, and the goal of a human life is the attainment of a harmonious relationship with this higher universe. And I'd want to say that in the contemporary secular world, there are many striking marks or signs or signals of transcendence. And we might want to reflect from a Christian perspective on the differences between the Christian construal of these signs of transcendence with the ancient Stoic or, for example, the Buddhist view of life. Not least because of the centrality of the idea of love in the Christian tradition, which of course is nonsense to the Stoic and unintelligible to the Buddhist. And the key figure in our history of theosis is Denis the Areopagite, who presents Christianity in terms of the Platonic mysteries and uses the language of eros explicitly. He's trying to show us how to realize the vital presence of God in the soul and in the natural world. And indeed, he's assuming that we can only know what is akin to us. We are made in the image of God, but only potentially in his likeness. And that's why we might say that only God can say truly that I am. But let me conclude with the inspiring words of one of the greatest French philosophers, Henri Bergson. Men do not sufficiently realize that their future is in their own hands. Theirs is the task of determining, first of all, whether they want to go on living or not. And this is the responsibility then for deciding if they want to merely live or intend to make just that extra effort required for fulfilling, even on their refractory planet, the essential function of the universe, which is a machine for the making of gods. Now that's a very puzzling and perplexing statement from Henri Bergson from his two sources of morality and religion. But I think from the context of this broader tradition of philosophical reflection about theosis and theological reflection about theosis, we can gain some insight into what he is attempting to say. Thank you very much indeed.